But let's pan around now and have a look at St William's College. So this had originally been built as a home of priests, a very wealthy college, saying prayers for the dead, earning vast sums for the church, in the belief, of course, that by saying prayers for the dead you could aid their passage into the next life. But the story I want to tell you about that is actually after the Catholic period. We're into the 17th century. And so these priests that had been singing masses for the dead, that college had been shut down with the Reformation. The early Christian churches struggled with the existence of ghosts. After all, God sat in judgment on all souls, and the good went to heaven, the bad went to hell. So it left little room for ghosts. But the church kind of sought to square the circle. And in the 12th century, the concept of purgatory was widely accepted. Those whose sins were not so severe as to warrant being dispatched to hell would be purified by fire to atone for their sins. So perhaps that's what's happening here. So during their time in purgatory, it was accepted they could return to the earth as ghosts to help atone for their sins. Prayers could be purchased to help expedite the souls through purgatory, and the chantry colleges made huge sums. So after the Reformation, this college had lost much of its income. It still housed several wealthy clerics, but it also had some more humble lodgers, including two brothers. So life was hard for the poor in 17th century York, and many turned to crime to make ends meet. Pickpockets and cutthroats were commonplace amongst the dark and lonely alleys. Now we're told that one dark and moonless night, the brothers were desperate to boost their earnings, and so they hatched a terrible plan. They planned to rob one of the wealthy clerics just as he was returning home. So the older brother was the ringleader, and he persuaded his younger, impressionable brother to take part with him to aid him in the robbery. So they waited in the shadows, and just as the clergyman would have been coming to this door, of course, we have murk and shadow. So he was almost home when the brothers jumped on him, and the older brother slit his throat and took his purse and other valuables. The younger brother was said to be distraught. He thought he was getting involved in a street robbery, and now he'd been part of a murder. He'd been a reluctant partner all along, and now he feared not just for his life, but for his very soul. So he locked himself and the priest's possessions inside an old oak cabinet. And now the older brother feared what would happen next. He believed his brother would break down and confess, leading both to the gallows. So he decided to tell them all, and he went off to inform the authorities. But he placed the entire responsibility on his younger brother. Whereupon the younger brother was arrested, detained, put on trial, found guilty, and hanged for murder. So the elder brother had escaped justice and the noose, but he couldn't escape the voices in his head. He lived every day with a persistent demon of guilt over his betrayal. And at night, he couldn't sleep. He could be heard pacing the floorboards in the room above us, the creaking floorboards as he wandered back and forth, until one night the footsteps simply stopped. The following morning, he was found dead, an anguished face contorted by the rope around his neck that hung him from a beam, however, failed to erase his guilt. And it's claimed that his footsteps can still be heard late at night as his unquiet spirit paces out for all of eternity. So, the chat is frozen. I can't see you say anything, but I do hope you can hear me. It appears to be recording well, so you can just catch this later, then let's do so. But let's continue onwards with our walk and with our story. I'll tell you now the story of the children of the Bedern. So before the building of St William's College, the main residence of the priests in this area was in Bedern. But by the Victorian era, Bedern had degenerated into an area of slums and kind of small workshops. They were mostly occupied by poor Irish immigrants, the majority of whom would only have one room for themselves. And with such low kind of life expectancy, it probably seemed fitting to the parish authorities to establish a chilling type of orphanage called workhouse on the site. And this was known as the York Industrial Ragged School. Its master had a reputation of a man of cruel temperament and a ferocious nature. Now he was paid well to round up the local waifs and strays and put them hard at work. Now the avaricious man paid out as little as possible on food and clothing for his downtrodden workforce. We believe that his miserable charges died in great numbers from starvation, disease, exposure and neglect. So although the orphans of the Ragged School rarely survived for long, this was of little concern to the master. His unpaid workers were easily replaced by more waifs and strays rounded up from York's shabby slums and alleyways. And the events that I'm describing took place in 1848, which we know was an incredibly harsh winter. So give him the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe the ground was simply too frozen to dig graves. But a less charitable view is that the master wished to hide their deaths in order to continue to collect the money that had been granted from the parish for their upkeep. Now it's said that the bodies of the deceased children were locked in a large cupboard at the rear of the workhouse, where they lay cold and stiff, awaiting their graves, until eventually the stench of rotting bodies filled the workhouse. So as the bodies began to build up over the winter, the master began to be troubled by his deeds. He became convinced that late at night he could hear the laughter of long dead chargers as they played in the streets outside the workhouse, free at last. He would rise sleepily from his bed and with a flickering oil lamp in hand, go down the stairs into the cold, empty workhouse. Once downstairs, his curiosity turned instead to fear, as he believed he could hear the terrified screams of his unfortunate chargers emanating from the stinking, locked cupboard. Night after night, he would hear the same sounds, and it began to drive him to desperation. Now, in some versions of this story, it's said that he was driven mad by these nightly visitations, and he took a huge knife from the kitchen and massacred the children as they slept in the cold, flea-ridden dormitory. It's said the authorities discovered him the next morning, whimpering amongst a heap of mutilated bodies, the bodies of his unfortunate chargers, and were told that he was dragged off to the local asylum, where he spent the rest of his days in solitary confinement. And it's said that the only sound to ever come from his cell was that of him pleading over and over again with his young victims for forgiveness. Now, it's difficult to know whether this story is fully true, whether it actually happened. It certainly wasn't reported in the newspapers of the day. What we do know, though, is that York Industrial Ragged School was closed here in the spring of 1849, and the school was moved to a site of the workhouse on Marygate. Again, the church and the parish records do not tell us why the school was closed. There are stories that several more bodies were found after the school had closed. But was it just that the master was spooked by the place? No. Nervous locals for many years afterwards have refused to enter the area of Bedern after dark. The restless spirits of the dead children are still occasionally seen playing in the midnight streets in the Bedern area. A number of years ago, a local man was in the habit of taking his dog for a late night walk along Goodramgate reported that one moonlit night, as he was passing the entrance to Bedern, he heard the sound of children's voices. And curious to know why young children should be playing out so late, he turned into the archway to investigate. But to his surprise, his faithful dog growled and bristled and refused to move forward, no matter how hard he encouraged him. So the owner left his dog to investigate alone. And coming through the archway, he could clearly hear the sounds of young children happily playing. But as he approached, the sound suddenly stopped, and he could find no trace of human activity. Now others have reported the strange sensation of a tiny hand reaching out to clasp theirs. Perhaps a lonely orphan looking for the love and protection in the afterlife that he was so cruelly denied in his own lifetime. So that is a rather sad, tragic story of the children of the Bedern. In the Bedern, a Bedern place of prayer. A rather ghoulish tale for a place of prayer. I'll just get a sip of water and we'll start our next story. And unfortunately, it's another story that relates to great suffering, a rather sad story to relate to you all. And this story is set in the grim days of the 17th century York, a city still plagued with superstition and a fear of the unknown. Now, in these times, people born with physical defects were often regarded as having been marked out by the devil. There was a fervent belief in superstition. A child born with impairment was reflection upon the parent, and very often these people become the focal point for abuse and torment. And that was certainly the case here in York. Young Marmaduke Buckle was born into this often sad and ignorant world in 1697. And he lived, let's cross over the road, in a building that's now an Italian restaurant. So he was born into a wealthy family, but with serious physical disabilities, and he was considered, quite frankly, an embarrassment. And as he grew up, he became more and more isolated by his illness, by his affliction. And every day he faced ignorance and superstition. He was persecuted and bullied by the local neighbourhood boys. And as time went on, he became more and more withdrawn and rarely ventured beyond this small upstairs room. So he lived here, right in the middle of your picture now. It's currently La Piazza. If I shine my light up there, you should see the top garrets. That is where his room was. He would spend hour upon hour up there in lonely isolation, gazing down at life in the busy street below. His isolation and depression grew, and eventually it led to a fateful decision. He took his penknife and he scratched his name into the plaster. It read, Marmaduke Buckle, 1697 to 1715, aged 17. He then placed a rope around his neck and hanged himself from a wooden beam. Now Marmaduke is not a hostile ghost, but he's often experienced within the building, within the restaurant. Has been for many years. And the people who've encountered him say that they can be having a fabulous night, but when they encounter Marmaduke, suddenly this terrible stillness and sadness comes over them. All their happy spirits are suddenly drained away, and they've experienced a sense of feeling watched by the lonely boy of Goodramgate. Marmaduke Buckle hanged himself in this building in 1715. It's a beautiful night here in York. A little cold and chilly, but the light, I think, is working beautifully. For us, it's creating super atmosphere. I do hope that you are on the other end watching this. The chat is not moving, but I've learned that doesn't necessarily mean you're not there, so I do hope so. And that you're enjoying these stories. So onwards and upwards. So our next story is about a celebrity ghost. A chap called Thomas Percy. We heard about the 6th Earl of Northumberland, who was in love with Anne Boleyn. This is a story about his son, the 7th Earl. And he was a kind of man of action. He was born into times of political turmoil and religious strife in the second half of the 16th century. And his dissatisfaction with Queen Elizabeth's rule led to a desire to see the return of a Catholic monarch and his involvement in an attempted rebellion to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. So Percy joined up with the Earl of Westmoreland and led an attempted rebellion in the year of 1569. They expected that they were going to be supported by an uprising of northern Catholics. But this failed to materialise, and so the rebellion soon crumbled. The Earl of Westmoreland fled to France, but Percy headed north of the border, thinking he'd be safe in Scotland. But he was captured and brought back to York in chains to be executed for the crime of high treason. And on the 22nd of August 1572, he climbed the scaffold in Parliament Street and he swore his allegiance to the Catholic cause and to Mary, Queen of Scots. The axeman brought down the axe. In one swoop, the nobleman's head and neck were separated, and his headless body was carried away to be buried in the churchyard of St Crux, near the Shambles. But as a traitor, his head was placed on a spike on Micklegate Bar, as a grisly warning to others thinking of rebelling. So for 2 years, those coming and going through the gate will be looked down upon by the head of Lord Percy. But then in 1574, we're told that his head was stolen by persons unknown. These people were in fact Catholic sympathisers. And it's said that they placed his head in a grave, unmarked, here on Goodramgate at the Church of Holy Trinity. They gave his head, in effect, a Christian burial. And there's been many reports, dark winter nights, of the sighting of the headless ghost of the Earl, going from grave to grave, trying to search for his missing head. And there's a lovely, slightly chilling epitaph to this. On the scaffold, Thomas Percy's last words were, "I am Percy in life and in death." And it's here at the Church of Holy Trinity that he inhabits our realm in death. So a visit to York wouldn't be complete without a trail through the Snickleways. So let's do that as we kind of wrap towards the end of our tour. And in times gone by, of course, these dark unlit alleyways and courtyards were homes to cutthroats, vagabonds and thieves, and citizens of wealth wouldn't dream of entering these denizens. They had good reason to fear and to stay away. But the biggest threat was not criminals keeping a shadowy vigil, but something altogether more disturbing. Indeed, something truly terrifying. Something not of this earth, not of this world. Not a man, but a beast, known as the Barguest, the Boguest. It is a spiritual apparition of a dog, of a wolf, shot through English and Celtic tradition, a giant apparition, like the one that appears, of course, in Whitby, Count Dracula. It's a motif that comes up over and over again in stories. And it's said that in York, the Boguest roams the Snickleways, the alleyways. That, of course, run from street to street. It's in these alleyways that we see and hear the dog. It scuttles backwards and forwards. We hear its claws, its growl, as it trots down the alleyways that run between the ancient streets of York. Streets that are so narrow, these alleyways, of course, that two people can struggle to pass one another. It's not something you would really want to encounter. And the descriptions that we have, the Barguest, are of a huge black dog with glowing red eyes that stalk the Snickleways at night. They're rarely seen. There's only been a handful of sightings. But of course, every one of them memorable. So night travellers need to be wary, because for those that witness the sight of the Barguest, it's said to seal the fate of the unfortunate soul within a year of the visitation by the Barguest. They'll be carried to the gates of hell. So it looks like we're blocked on that side by a big party in that particular alleyway. So I'm going to walk us around this way to come to our next destination. So we're coming into Stonegate, and if York is said to be the most haunted city in Europe, and I hope this tour tonight goes some way to explaining how it came to have that particular status, you'd have to say that Stonegate is the most haunted street in all of York. So we are perhaps entering Spirit Central. Literally every building in the street seems to have its own story. So I'm going to pick out a couple to share for you before we wrap up this evening's tour. And the first one relates to the pub, the Old Star Inn, which runs the sign across the road. And there are various stories related to the Star Inn. One of them is that this was used during the English Civil War to be a mortuary for the soldiers that had been killed in combat during the Siege of York, and that there are several undead spirits that wander the cellars, the stairways, souls that cannot find peace. But more interestingly, it's often animal spirits that are encountered in the Old Star Inn. There is a ghost cat that runs around, and if you go in there with a dog, it's likely the dog will be driven quite mad. There's an incident not so long back where a dog darted off to chase something. The owners couldn't see what it was, and it chased it with such ferocity it smacked its head into the wall and knocked itself clean out. The ghost cat, of course, laughing, the hapless dog. But it does seem that animal spirits are just as prevalent as human ones, and of course here in York, with our love of cats, why would we not be delighted at the story of a ghost cat? Every building, as I say, in Stonegate has a story, but none perhaps as many as the stories that relate to number 35, Stonegate. It's been long believed that construction work on buildings can unleash paranormal activity, and that certainly seems to be the case here in 35 Stonegate. This building sits in front of Barley Hall, which would have cut through, but unfortunately it was full up with people listening to a ghost story, so I've taken this a long way around. There was demolition work carried out during the 1980s, and it would seem it awoke something in this area. So no one could have imagined what lay beneath. And stories of hauntings of 35 Stonegate actually go back centuries. So it seems it reawoke something that had been there for a long time. So this is 35 Stonegate coming into view, the lit shop window below. And we're told that one of the classic stories here relates to Lawrence Sterne, the author of Tristram Shandy, famous first comic novel in the English language. He lived next door at number 33. And Lawrence Sterne told a story about the goings-on in 35 Stonegate. And he told of an old miser that lived here at number 35. The old man was terrified of being robbed, and so every night as the minster bells chimed 12 midnight, he would take his walking stick and hammer on the floor, on the walls, and his bed frame to scare away would-be assailants. So Lawrence Sterne became so accustomed to this nightly noise that he came to view it as a harmless eccentricity, although he had noted it had been getting louder recently. And so when one day he happened to encounter the nephew of his noisy neighbour entering the property, he decided to raise the matter. He politely inquired after the health of his neighbour, and Sterne was at first puzzled and then horrified to hear the old man had died some 3 months previously. So Sterne may have been the first, but he certainly wasn't the last to feel unnerved by the activities of 35 Stonegate. and he promptly moved on. It seems that the extensive renovations of the 1980s reawoke the spirits of the house. It was acquired by the famous astrologer Jonathan Caner in the 1990s, and initially it was used as a shop to sell astrological merchandise and as a place for tarot readings. But Caner became so used to living alongside the ghosts, he decided to open up 35 Stonegate as a haunted house. It was a choice that had very profound consequences. Now, crowds poured in to witness the experience of being in a haunted house, and many paid to be part of seances. But the experience simply proved far too intense for most people, and it was soon only a hardcore of paranormal obsessives and researchers that would enter. In an infamous episode of TV, Derek Acora filmed an episode of the Ghosts Town Live at 35 Stonegate. It was in January 2006. He was apparently strangled and tipped over the back of a chair and lifted by a lively spirit. And afterwards, he declared there to have been at least 15 spirits inside the building. Jonathan Caner soon closed the attraction. He cited financial concerns, though at the time he was the most successful astrologer on the planet. And while he would not discuss further his reasons for closing it, he did issue a statement. In it, he said, "I consider it a matter of great personal responsibility to ensure that all the spirits, memories, ghosts and other residual ethereal entities connected to this property are fully and properly laid to rest by a team of highly experienced spiritual mediums. Future inhabitants and visitors to Stonegate can rest assured that once these ceremonies are performed," assured Caner, "they'll have no trouble or disturbance from anything relating to the past of 35 Stonegate." He said nothing more and never again discussed the ghost of 35 Stonegate, and he died suddenly in 2016, so we'll never hear any more on the subject. But with the silence of Caner came a silence from the ancient residents of the building. It's now a popular clothes shop, and there's been no incidents reported here since 2014. 35 Stonegate. So, with Stonegate there was Haunted Street in the city. Let us tell you another story relating to this very space. This time in relation to number 41 Stonegate. Now, it's believed that love can endure from even beyond the grave, and the many tales of ghostly lovers returning to their love left behind. But this story is about the enduring love between a father and a daughter. So here at number 41 Stonegate, a successful doctor lived in the Victorian era with his daughter. His wife had died in childbirth, and so his 6-year-old daughter was the kind of apple of his eye. She looked exactly like his deceased wife, and with a friendly manner and a beautiful long blonde hair, she was loved by the domestic servants and by the patients visiting the practice. She had a bedroom right up at the top of 41 Stonegate, and the doctor loved to host parties for his affluent clientele. He threw lavish dinner parties frequently, and his daughter would always be introduced to the assembled guests before being packed off to bed. So unsurprisingly, the child felt she was missing out and often reappeared downstairs. And on the night in question, this had happened, and the father, who normally indulged and forgave such transgressions, was visibly cross with the girl. He took her back up 3 flights of stairs and told her she must not under any circumstances come back down. So clearly the girl knew he was serious. She watched him looking over the banister as he descended. He was soon gone, and the party again was in full swing. Now the doctor noticed that wine was running low and decided to visit a nearby pub for some supplies. He was not gone many minutes. He only went to the pub just over there, the Star that we passed a moment ago. But as he returned, he knew immediately that something had happened. His guests were all outside, stood in the street, and when he tried to enter, they held him back. It seems that desperate not to miss out on the party, the child had got a chair from her room to stand on so she could lean further over the banister to see and hear more. At this point, she overbalanced and plummeted 3 floors and was killed instantly when she landed on the tiled floor of the hallway. Now, the doctor apparently never recovered from the tragedy. He never again threw a party and lived alone with a small, trusted domestic staff. His health began to deteriorate, and some 7 years after the death of his beloved daughter, he took to his bed and died a few weeks later. And it seems that the small, loyal household agreed to make no public mention of the little girl with the long blonde hair that never left his bedside in his final days. The little girl is still seen to this day. She's every bit as curious. Footsteps are often heard on the stairs. There's been a number of sightings of the girl that sits on the shop counter and swings her legs. She's described as a pretty little Victorian girl with the most incredibly blonde hair that you've ever seen. The ghosts of Stonegate. Let us go down to the Shambles to finish our evening tour. An evening tour in York without the Shambles would seem like you've been shortchanged. So I'm not going to do that for you. But many tourists, of course, heading down to the Shambles will assume that, of course, given its age, that it would be haunted. After all the streets leading to it are ancient. Here on Petergate, many occasions and stories relating to apparitions. King's Square, which leads into it, of course, once the home of the Viking palace. For 2 centuries, the home of the Vikings and their bloody deeds. You'd expect to find in this area lots and lots of reports of apparitions, of ghostly activities, of appearances, the unexplained. And yet, surprisingly, the Shambles seems to be rather low in terms of its numbers of sightings, of apparitions, of spirits, of poltergeists, you name it. The Shambles hasn't got it. Which I know is a bit of a disappointment for people because they want the granddaddy of our medieval streets to be the pinnacle. It's not to say that there aren't any spirits on site. Quite clearly there are. But they're not perhaps in the same league as some of the others that we've been talking about tonight. But nonetheless, as people head down the streets, perhaps they're looking out for the mystery cats of York, maybe seeing spectral cats, ghost cats along the way. Who knows? But as they're searching, it is said there is often being viewed a man in a bowler hat. He seems to be a 20th century figure. We don't know who he is, what he did, where he comes from, what his significance is. But a man in a bowler hat has been seen in and around the doorways of the Shambles on several occasions. There is also reportings of a butcher. Again, not hugely surprising, of course. We know the Shambles was the street of the butchers. So we're just coming into the top of the Shambles in just one moment. We'll just head down there so you can experience that. We're passing over the junction of Goodramgate into King's Square, the location of the Viking King's Palace. The night's getting colder, the streets are getting quieter. So who knows, maybe tonight we'll experience for ourselves one of these resident ghosts in the Shambles. So we're also told that there is a figure of a butcher. What many don't realise as they're kind of walking through here actually is they're walking through a graveyard. That on this spot where during the daytime vast crowds come together to watch the street entertainers, they're actually standing upon a graveyard. The church was here into the middle of the Victorian era, and the eagle-eyed may well spot, of course, the gravestones in the streets. Others will walk across them, not even notice. But such is the nature of York, that with all these centuries of uninterrupted living, there are far more residents below the ground than there are above it. So consequently, York is a city of the dead as much as it's a city of the living. So, as I say, they come to the Shambles and they expect, or they hope, they're going to find multiple apparitions, sightings, and sadly what they're most likely to encounter is a great big queue to get into the ghost merchants. So perhaps what the spirits refuse to provide en masse, now the York ghost merchants provide instead. A hugely successful business that sells little individual sculptures of ghosts. As I say, there's very few actual sightings of ghosts in this street to say how old it is. But there was fairly recently in this building just down here, which was the Shambles Tavern. It was caught on camera actually, which is kind of interesting, on CCTV, and it was kind of widely looked at and said there's no tampering with this. That boxes of glasses had fallen off a shelf with some force. So some Christmas decorations up there. What is interesting is very, very close to the Shambles, we find reputedly the most haunted pub both in York, but quite possibly in Britain. It is the Golden Fleece. We're going to see it in just one moment. And apparently it's brimming with ghosts. With over kind of 500 years of existence, this former coaching inn has had plenty of time to acquire the spectres. There are talk of figures disappearing through walls, rattling keys, disembodied footsteps, people being touched. But few of the things are said to plague this ancient hostelry. There's officially 5 ghosts here, resident of the Golden Fleece. As I say, it's rumored to be one of the most haunted of all. The paranormal activity here records strange light anomalies, items being thrown off the bar. And the Golden Fleece has gained a reputation by being haunted by a variety of eerie spectres of ghostly children dressed in rags. They're said to be running up and down the corridors. Now there's another sighting of a Second World War pilot. It's alleged that he either committed suicide or he fell from an upstairs window in a drunken stupor. It said he was a Canadian airman. In the months leading up to D-Day, there were so many North American, Canadian, US troops that they had to find room for all of them, and some were billeted here. And it's said that a Canadian airman was up in the top room, perhaps having a smoke, leaned out, and he fell to his death. And he has a habit of not only frequenting the building, but also taking people's keys. So frequently, residents, guests staying here at Britain's most haunted pub, complain that they put down their keys, but then they're never found again. It's a strange phenomenon, but it's happened over and over again. There's another ghost here called John, who seems to be quite aggressive and threatening to women as they try and communicate with him. There's been obviously seances done in here, and John can get very, very angry. He often has the words death or kill spelt out on Ouija boards when people are trying to contact him. So even those hardened of ghost hunters are reluctant to chat to John. And there was apparently once a group of sort of ghost hunters in the bedroom of John, where John is most frequently seen, hoping out and calling for some paranormal activity. When unexpectedly a noise was heard, they all turned around and noticed that a coat hanger was now on the floor. The remaining coat hangers were swinging violently to and fro in a manner very similar to a pendulum. And the witnesses said that no one had even been in the close proximity of the wardrobe that could have moved or banged the wardrobe. In the midst of all this chaos, they could still hear the coat hangers moving in the wardrobe too, causing a lot of screaming in the room by the shocked ghost hunters, who left vowing never to return. What of course they could have done is to seek sanctuary in the church over there. So the final story of our evening is about All Saints Church. All Saints Church on Pavement, is famous illuminated lantern tower. And the story I'll tell you just before we do so is I want to draw your attention to the sanctuary knocker. A sanctuary was something that existed in Old English law, that if you were accused of a crime, if you could make good your escape and get to a sanctuary, the church would take you in. You would then have, in the run of about 3 to 4 weeks, to either make the peace with your accusers, or you have to stand trial and make restitution. So the idea was to try and get to the door, to lay your hands. And so in order to make this a proven fact, a sanctuary knocker was put in place. If you could put one hand on the sanctuary knocker, the church must take you in, offer you sanctuary. And so we are hugely fortunate that here in York we have one of these sanctuary knockers. Now, of course, this is a replacement. It's far too precious, but it's a precise rendering. It's medieval sanctuary knocker. As we look upon it and look to reach our hands, what first appears to be a beast, we look a little closer, and it's a beast with a man in his mouth. So it really is quite a dark images. It's being swallowing a human being. So our final story here tonight is a telling about York's most beautiful ghost. And she's said to appear mostly at funerals, and the figure is that of a woman wearing a long white dress. Now, some say it's a wedding dress, others suggest it's a funeral shroud. It's described as being made of a shimmering material which flows down to the ground and floats gracefully close to this here doorway. Her hair was described as extremely long and neatly dressed in beautiful curls. Many have commented on her beautiful complexion. And in one version of the story is that she's a bride forever waiting for a groom who was murdered on the way to the wedding. His body was never found, and so she appears at all the funerals to see if her beloved has finally appeared, so that they can pass into the afterlife together. It's a lovely story. Let's hope one day she finds her betrothed and they can pass off together for peace and eternity. So that is the final story that I have for you this evening. I do hope you've enjoyed your time of technical glitches notwithstanding.